Did you want to go more to the differences between the two villages?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically these two villages, I picked them because they're stand-ins for kind of what's going on at the large scale in China. And then the other thing is I basically picked these villages because they are construction worker sending villages. So in China, basically, if you go to any village, there's usually like one dominant source of livelihood, because most of the people who have been living in that village, they're old kinship structures that have been in that village for centuries, basically. And so the way they find jobs is through kin-based norms, right? So you ask your uncle or your cousin where they worked, and they introduce you to their boss, and that's how you find employment in most of these rural countryside villages. The median education for this village, as most villages are, is around a middle school education. And so most of these workers were looking for informal work in cities. Cities pay better, coastal cities pay the best, but they're also very tricky and really risky. So I had people talk to me and tell me about how in the 1980s they used to go to Beijing to work, and it was just so precarious that you would have to sleep in the train station, and in the middle of the night, people would come, other migrant workers would come and sort of try to steal money off of you. So they put their money in their socks to protect them. So everyone has stories like this. This is the main way to make a living. You can't really make a living farming, especially in relatively less fertile villages. So in my villages, construction was basically the highest paying work there was. You could work for a factory, maybe make 2,000 RMB. This is around 2012. So you can do the conversion in your head, but around 2,000 RMB was the average factory wage. Construction, if you worked your way up, by the time you were 35 or so, you could earn 4,000 RMB per month. So it was much higher paying than other alternatives. On the other hand, it was really risky. And then I started realizing construction is a really interesting thing to study for a couple of reasons. One is construction is a weird industry in China. Like basically in construction, I just started thinking about it, and construction sort of marries together the two developmental moments that I previously talked about, this labor-intensive industrialization plus this more industrialization through land, villages selling off their land. In construction, basically, you need both. You need cheap labor to build stuff, and then you need land to build stuff on. And then construction is also weird too, and I think it's emblematic of all of the different tensions embedded in migrant labor. Because in construction, things are so casualized. Basically, you work for a subcontractor who's another person in your village, and that person in your village basically has the job of delivering 10, 20 construction workers to some construction site. At the construction site, there's another guy who's also a middleman, and then maybe above him is maybe the construction enterprise. So you're maybe 3 layers down in terms of informalized subcontracting. And because of that, construction enterprises basically started paying workers at the end of the year. In factories, they get paid at the end of the month. It's a lot safer if you're a worker, because if you lose a month's wages, it's not as debilitating as if you lose a whole year's wages. And the reason that construction can do this is basically construction enterprises most of them don't get bank funding unless they're SOEs. And the central state traditionally did not give them bank funding because they didn't want to fuel kind of runaway inflationary overspending in construction, which is incidentally what's happening now, but that's another story. So this is kind of a diagram of what I just talked about. So basically, construction is a very interesting thing to study because due to this casualized kind of wage payment system, most workers are really highly dependent on their families back at home. So while you're working, your kids are still behind the village. How are they subsisting? Well, grandma and grandpa are farming the land, and everybody's sort of getting by until you come home with the end of year wages. So there's a lot of sort of lending cash among the villagers in order to get by while they waited for their wages. I have some pictures here. This is a group of village women. They would take wages for construction and build homes. And so this is an example of the kinds of homes they would build. They were concrete and tiled homes. This is a bunch of workers. They're kind of waiting for their subcontractor to arrive at the village so that he can deliver them their wages. This is a guy in the village who had, I have all these stories in the book about different workers and how they fared, and this is his wife. So this is one of the labor subcontractors. who was tasked with bringing workers from the villages to the cities. So the way I found my two villages is this guy is basically the brother-in-law of one of the workers in Farming Village, but he himself is from Landing Village. So I quickly realized that there was this kind of interregional labor trade going on, whereby subcontractors from Landing Village were going off to a whole bunch of neighboring villages, kind of corralling up 10, 20 workers from each village, and then sending them off to Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and other big cities to work. And so basically, this is how migrant labor within the construction sector generally works. It's a little different if you look at manufacturing. Manufacturing is a little bit more like you just go to the factory, you take the test on the appointed day, and then you get in or not. So it's a little less kinship based, but construction really relies on this kinship recruitment strategy. Yeah, so basically, I look at these two villages. In one village, in Farming Village, everybody still has their land and everything's going on as normal. In the other village, in Landing Village, everyone starts losing their land because the local government has started to confiscate land in order to sell it off to agribusinesses and real estate developers. And they basically do this rural revitalization or modernization campaign there, which is basically take all the rural people, put them in high rises, make them kind of into townspeople, and then use the land that had previously laid fallow or been, basically farmed by households, which is not very efficient, and give it to agribusinesses, which can, really raise productivity and raise capital. So it's kind of how it works out for people in Landing is it's a double-edged sword, right? On one hand, you get a lot more capital investment in coming to your village. So you can kind of try to use that capital investment in various ways, like not in my village, but in other villages that other of my colleagues have studied. There's evidence of people saying, okay, I still have my land rights. I'm going to try to build up a small migrant dormitory so that factory workers who come to work at the factories that are being built in my newly modernizing village can come live in my dormitory, etc. That's only possible if you still have land rights. In my village, almost everybody lost all of their land rights. So it was kind of difficult without any kind of property rights to start small businesses like this. So what I observed was a huge stratification. Like the entrepreneurs, like Boss Bo, who I just showed you, the labor subcontractors fared well. They would take the earnings that they took from the previous 20 years of labor contracting, and they took those earnings and pumped them to small businesses. So a lot of people started small auto shops and auto repair shops on the outskirts of Chongqing. A lot of people bought properties. So I have some pictures of the properties. The village I studied actually is now today a periphery district of Chongqing. It was kind of reabsorbed into that. So this is Boss Bo's wife. She bought this, they bought this apartment on the outskirts of Chongqing, and the price has actually appreciated very nicely. And it's, this is their old house, which was eventually expropriated from them. They received demolition money as well as land compensation money. And that's kind of the usual outcome for mostly land losing peasants in China. So I'll stop there.
That was an excellent overview, and I think it sets us up really well to kind of zoom into the stories that you detail so well in your book. One of the big things that stood out to me as I was reading your book, and you mentioned various ways that this manifests, is the insecurity that these migrant workers faced. And just you touched on it briefly, but I want to kind of circle back and get to the real reasons why they left their subsistence farming. Why not invest more in agricultural productivity or in other economic activity in the village? Why take this big risk of working this contract for a year and then maybe the subcontractor bows out and I'm left with nothing?
Right. No, it's a great question. Indeed, the people who had the most social capital in Farming Village did exactly what you said, because it's why work this very precarious labor contract where you essentially have no rights and you're just super highly dependent on one guy to pay your wages, right? And they don't have to pay the wages. So actually, the most powerful people in Farming Village did not do migrant labor. So there were people in the village, for example, there were these two brothers. One of them is actually the owner of this house. So this house was built somewhat from remittances from migrant labor, but mainly from remittances from migrant labor contracting. So basically, migrant labor was a good gig only if you were a labor contractor, if you were the guy who was the middleman. It's a bad gig if you're the guy at the very bottom. So what most people with social capital did was they would either start small businesses, and then they would take profits from that small business to put into becoming a labor subcontractor. So the guy who owned this house, his brother, I believe, their father had been fairly prominent in the village during socialism and somehow had controlled kind of they had they eventually got rights to a pretty attractive plot of land that had the ability to grow herbs with medicinal qualities. So he had somehow, through being good on good terms with, or himself part of the village committee that did land allocations in the 1980s, got themselves a nice plot of land, used it to build out a small medicinal herb business where they were selling medicinal herbs in the local county seat. And that generated some good money. And it was, more in their control, right? So less risky than doing migrant labor. But the profits from migrant labor contracting were just so great that eventually they abandoned that business, took the profits from it, and put it into trying to become a labor broker. Most of the people who could, so in Farming Village, nobody lost their land rights when I was there. But in Landing Village, most of the people who could actually afford an apartment like the one I showed just a second ago, most of those people were labor contractors who had taken the profits and then used them to build out small businesses elsewhere. So there were a number of people in Landing Village who did this. Generally in Landing Village, you didn't have as much farming going on because the land was so rocky and the terrain was very mountainous, actually. So Landing Village was actually the poorer of the two villages before development. After land commercialization, it became obviously the richer of the two villages because it's now basically an urban district of Chongqing. So it is kind of an interesting story of like rising and falling fates. Like basically 1980s, if you lived in Landing Village, life was tough. Like everybody did migrant labor because they had to. Um, there was no kind of medicinal herb business going on there because the land was just so unarable. In fact, Bospo, the guy who owned this apartment that you can see here, he has himself all of these stories about how he first went to Beijing when he was 15 years old. He was among the first migrant workers to go there. It was intensely traumatic for him. And he has these sort of nice stories about how he saw a business opportunity where others didn't, and he saw, he was willing to take on risk where others weren't. And yeah, I think that the livelihood options at the time they're very specific to villages. Villages that had migrant labor earlier on later accumulated a little bit more remittance income that they could channel into local businesses. And then if you were in Landing Village particularly, the one thing that they had no arable land, but they did have proximity to Chongqing. So if you could channel somehow migrant labor remittances into a small business or buy property on the edge of Chongqing earlier on, that led to a lot more capital accumulation for those households.
Yeah, I have to say the story of the labor brokers was one of my favorite parts of the book, especially Bospo. I'm glad you mentioned him already. Was a really interesting character to me. In addition, I have a question about the prominent villager who started the medicinal. Um, that was the guy that had the mythology around him during the famine, right? Some people were saying, oh, he was um, fasting, while other people were saying he was hoarding food. Correct? He
Right.
had those.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
and so thinking from that story, I wanted to kind of understand what were the um, what were the expectations that villagers had for labor brokers? Obviously, they occupied a prominent position in the village, and so what was kind of the expectation for them, and um, what was the extent of the labor brokers' influence on the community?
Mm. Yeah, that's a great question. That was kind of what got me started on this project because I was living in the first village, Farming Village, and people came to me with these totally insane stories about Bospo in particular, but other labor contractors as well. Everybody was working construction. Not everybody, but a large portion of the villages were working construction. Most of them tried to work for local contractors, and they would tell me local brokers are better, especially ones that you have kin ties with, because they're more accountable, obviously. Boss Bo is a special case because he was the brother-in-law of a local villager, but people soon came to see his brother and the wife. It was his So the wife of the sister-in-law of Bospo was actually a resident of Farming Village. Um, and she herself um, was kind of seen at the very beginning as a very trustworthy person, but later as Bospo, he had started, I think, contracting workers from Farming Village as early as 1997, really early on. People were reluctant to work for him because one of the first excursions he took them on, they complained, they came back and they said, oh my gosh, he's only giving us, I forget how much, probably 100 RMB per week to live on. That's not enough. He wouldn't pay us until the end of the year. And this was their first time working construction. So they all came home and said, this is exploitative. Bospo is a villain in this story. He's here just to take advantage of us, and he's using his kinship ties to basically trick us into what's basically labor peonage. Um, and later, a lot of other workers would go work for other outside brokers and say, actually, no, this is just how how construction is. That's what the employment contract, it's a normal thing in construction. Um, so you got these really conflicting stories for sure. If you went to Bospo himself, he would come to you and say, yes, look, the harsh reality is, yeah, we have this very informalized labor situation. They have to be used to hard work, and I lose a contract if my workers don't work. So he would tell me about workers who had cut loose and went to play video games in internet cafes instead of coming to work. He would tell me stories about workers who asked him for far too much. He basically has to draw into his own personal savings to give workers living allowances that can live on in Beijing. And so the idea is like, yeah, the labor broker introduces you to the employer, and then while you're working that 10, 11-month contract, he gives you out of his own personal savings money to live on. So you need money for food, you eat in the dormitory canteen. These dormitories are actually extremely dilapidated temporary buildings. They have these very informalized canteens. One worker told me about how one of his earliest, bitterest moments was when he went to Beijing to work, and it was January, and the canteen was empty because everyone went home for Chinese Lunar New Year, but they still made them work. They still had 10 more days on their contract. And so instead of feeding them, the broker basically had the agribusiness truck come in from a nearby agribusiness and just dump bushels of rotting cabbage onto the work site and said, this is like your food for the next 10 days or so. And this is entirely humiliating, but I mean, the harsh reality is these brokers, this is so casualized. Nobody gives them money to live on or food besides the brokers. And so the brokers would tell me stories about how difficult it was to manage their contracts and provide for everybody's livelihood and sustenance while they're working these contracts. And the fact is also brokers are also susceptible to all of this kind of risky business. Like the people who work above the brokers, these other labor contractors would often abscond without paying the brokers. So the brokers themselves were at high risk of wage arrears in addition. So what do you do if the funds from the project you're working on don't ever appear at the labor broker's hands? Like the broker himself has to absorb those costs as well. So yeah, you got all these contradictory stories floating around these labor brokers, but it is kind of just basically a product of the fact that this is a really casualized industry with high risk of wage arrears.
I mean, I think you've done a great job of cluing us into this very informal, unstable, very heavily trust-based migratory work system. And another part of the book I found interesting is what happens when we introduce a big shock to that migratory trust system. And specifically, I'm referring to in chapter 6, it's dedicated to the 2011 landing evictions. And so I just wanted to, how did how did the players in this system weather this, dramatic change in their life? How did the migrant workers who relied on their rural plots and to support them while going on these, risky job job opportunities, and how did the labor brokers who, relied on these workers having that, source of support, how did that all change with these evictions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, the point of the book is basically that this is something that economists miss and policymakers in China really miss, which is that, sure, it's great to commercialize land. It's great to realize new efficiencies with regard to rural land. But the fact is, like, migrant labor and the low-cost labor advantage that Chinese industries has enjoyed for the last 20, 30 years, all of it relies on migrant workers being able to survive these really low wages. Now, of course, in factories, I think it's a little bit different. In construction, it is literally impossible or very, very difficult to work a job where you don't get paid until the end of the year if you don't have land to rely on. Because where do your, if you don't have land, basically you have to pay rent or you have to pay into a mortgage. Usually when you lose your land, you receive big kind of lump sum payment, some kind of compensation from the government for losing your land. And then the government tells you, look, we have resettlement housing for you guys in this nearby township. You have to buy it. You can buy it at a subsidized rate, but most people are having to dig into their savings to buy these resettlement plots. So, and they're not plots, they're not land plots. Usually they are more high-rise apartment housing. So most households go into a little bit of debt in order to afford this. And then meanwhile, they're still having to pay down these mortgages on these newly acquired apartments while they're still working migrant labor. And by the way, migrant labor still has the same rules. No one cares that you don't have lands to rely on while you're working this contract. They still expect you to basically rely on your labor broker. And then if you have wage arrears, if someone absconds with your wages, you're basically screwed for the year. So it is actually very difficult to workers to continue working these high-risk jobs like construction after they lose their land. A lot of them that I met had pivoted towards safer jobs like service sector jobs in nearby townships or construction jobs, but not in coastal regions. Generally speaking, the longer you have to migrate to get to your job, the more levels of informal subcontracting middlemen exist between you and the guy who eventually actually pays you. And so the higher the risk of wage arrears. So most people would shift toward working local construction jobs, which paid less, or service sector jobs, or factory jobs. So the point of all of this is basically just to say that this low-cost labor advantage that China still enjoys, it's going to shift a little bit if you radically change land rights. Now, I'm not saying that wages will shift or that the labor employment contract will change definitely, because still most workers in the Chinese countryside are still employed in manufacturing, not construction. Construction still only employs a smaller proportion of rural labor. And in addition, accompanying all this rural modernization, the Chinese local governments are really trying to promote kind of local indigenous growth. So there's a real push to try to get rural people working in local businesses, starting their own small businesses. Rural tourism is a big kind of growth strategy. So I talked to a lot of local government officials who said, look, we're going to try to make our area into a nongjiale, kind of more of a rural tourism, small scale bed and breakfasts, restaurants and hotels and this kind of thing to attract urbanites who want a kind of a rural getaway. And so that kind of influences the jobs available to rural people. A lot of them are trying to look for and pivot toward more of these more local jobs, I think.
Staying on this topic of urbanization, you alluded to earlier in the talk about how the China case is unique because of these post-socialist legacies. Urbanization in China looks very different. And what your example you compared Chinese urbanization to was the historical example of urbanization in England. So I was just wondering if you could further, if you could talk about that comparison here.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so in my book, generally the paradigmatic thing is is that usually urbanization and industrialization happen at the same time. For most Western countries, that's been the normal trajectory of development, is how do you get an industrial workforce? Well, people go to cities and then they work for factories in the cities. That's kind of the Charles Dickens, you know, that's what he was chronicling when he wrote about, all of these children working in factories and industry in the middle of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And so I think that in China, the sequence of things has been reversed in some way. First, they had industrialization, and because of this very kind of draconian household registration hukou system, they were really able to limit the amount of rural people going to cities during industrialization. So in some sense, they had industrialization without urbanization for the 90s and early 2000s. And that was what generated the low-cost labor advantage, right? So basically, you're creating this huge subsidy for foreign direct investment, for corporations that manufacture in China. The big hidden subsidy of Chinese labor is that you don't have to pay a living wage that's commensurate to local living standards. So your factories in Shenzhen, you don't have to pay enough for people to, your workers to live in Shenzhen. You just have to pay enough for their families to get by in the Guangxi, Sichuan, Anhui, the poorer provinces that they come from. Why? Because you have this household registration system which disallows rural people from having their kids go to urban schools, from being able to buy property in urban places. Now that's changed a lot. A lot of this, a lot of the recent reforms have led to a unified hukou status, where people can apply for unified hukou, and if you lose your land, you're often offered urban hukou. And so now a lot of that urban-rural exclusion that was previously kind of enforced through the hukou system has now disappeared. However, it doesn't mean that rural people are now just as wealthy as urban people. It basically has kind of shifted the urban-rural inequality to townships. So now basically what you have is kind of a state-engineered urbanization. For a long time, the state said it's better for FDI and for our long-term labor-intensive industrialization strategy if rural people don't come to cities. And now they're saying, well, that created a lot of problems. The countryside is so poor, the cities are so rich, and actually we don't want to just specialize in low value add manufacturing. We're trying to scale up, climb the value chain, and for that to happen, we need to boost domestic consumption, which means we need to pay rural workers a lot more. And so a lot of this rural modernization is being billed as we're going to raise the standard of living among rural people by having them move to high-rise apartments. We're going to have urban townships built up so rural people can live there instead. They can work better jobs. They don't have to do the subsistence farming that is so degrading to them. Instead, they can work in service sector jobs in these new townships that we're going to pour investment dollars into. And on the whole, I think if you look at survey research, especially among Chinese economists who are looking at family panel studies, the Chinese family panel studies is a big longitudinal survey. People have looked at the China Finance Household Survey is another survey. Data from a lot of these big, large-scale surveys is saying that especially among people who are voluntarily leasing their land to agribusinesses, and back to the village collective, which is happening at a large scale now, the mean earning power of households after they lose their land does go up. So they do get exposure to a lot more earning opportunities once they lose their land. However, the variance, and a lot of qualitative case studies have kind of showed this as well, is that there's huge variation. It really depends on what your local economy looks like. So if you're in a coastal village, you lose your land, you might be far better off because there's so much more commercialization in coastal areas. If you're in an inland region and you're not an entrepreneur, maybe you're just a low, reserve army migrant worker, outcomes are probably not going to be as good for you because in order to move to that new township, you have to take on debts, take out a mortgage, and then on top of that, you don't have land to fall back on. And so this kind of upgrading of the rural economy through state-engineered urbanization is generating a large stratification. I think outcomes really vary. Coastal versus inland is versus entrepreneurial households are doing a lot better than non-entrepreneurial households, et cetera. And at the same time, there's a lot of anecdotal data, qualitative data, case study-based data about village collectives that have taken on these new ability to lease land and then become basically land developers themselves. A lot of them set up these kind of land sharing corporations where they share dividends from land commercialization. They might take up the village land, rent it out to a mall or some kind of agribusiness or agricultural processing facility, and they do share dividends, but at the same time, who they share those dividends to and in what amounts really varies. So you still see stratification among the villagers. People who had good political ties to village leaders often fare better than people who are on the peripheries of the village power structure. So yeah, I think there's a lot of variance in this process.
And you talked about a political shift going on from the state holding back urbanization to now state mandated urbanization. And so I kind of want to zoom back out and ask, how common are events like the landing eviction? Are we seeing a real push throughout, rural China? Is it located in certain provinces? And just
Yeah.
and give us a sense of the overall trajectory of where Chinese
Yeah,
urbanization is going.
that's a great question. So the overall thrust is that yes, a third of rural people has lost access to land rights, um, either through losing their farming land, but they still have their housing land, which means they can still live in their village-based housing, or they've lost both their farming land and their village-based housing, and now they're being relocated to large townships where they live in these high-rise apartments. So if you look at data from the China Finance Household Finance Survey, which is basically a big survey. This economist at I think Texas State University or maybe Texas A&M, I completely forget now, has run. So basically, it's a longitudinal survey from 2011 to 2020, 2019, and that survey shows that around 3 to 4% of households in rural areas have have been relocated to townships. A slightly higher percentage, so around 7 to 8%, has lost access to housing, to farming land. But the major change among most rural households is that around 40 to 50% of rural households has lost access to their farming land and their housing land, but not through government expropriation. My book is really about government forced expropriation, where the local governments rezone the land forcibly. Most of the transformations going on now is going on at the village level. So 40, 50 to 50%, it depends on how you're counting things, of rural people in the CFHS have lost land, but due to land leasing, which is voluntary, depending on who you ask, it's supposed to be voluntary legally. Joel Andreas and Xiaohua Zhan, two sociologists, have a lot of evidence that actually there's a lot of coercion going on, so it's not that voluntary. But what it basically is village collectives basically come in and say, we now, since 2013, have the legal right to lease this land to anyone we want. So we're going to pressure households to lease their land back to us, and then we're going to lease all of the village land to some developer. So that's what usually, for the most part, the majority of land loss looks like in China today, is voluntary land contracting or land leasing. And so a lot of economics, a lot of economists have taken data on this and done sort of these fancy methods to try to understand, okay, how does it affect earning power among households? And there is a prominent paper that shows that mean incomes have gone up for these land leasing households. I think it depends on how you're counting it. And also land leasing households are generally, I mean, it's a self-selecting group, right? If these are voluntary decisions, then you would expect only those households that don't currently use their land to lease out their land for development. And if that's the case, then yes, incomes should go up. But if you're looking at village collectives that forcibly coerce households to give up land, even if they don't want to give up the land, then you might see incomes fall. And so if you're looking at the data in the aggregate, it's hard to tell and to parse out which of these land leasing contracts is voluntary and which is not voluntary. And so aggregate numbers might not be as informative as regional case studies. A lot of regional case studies have shown actually that at least among in villages where these land leasings are more coerced and less voluntary, you see actually drops in income from pre to post land leasing.
I could keep going with the questions, but because this is such a rich topic, but I want to give other people a chance to ask their questions. So I'm going to open up for a Q&A right now. Sean.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor, for coming to speak with us today. I had two kind of questions. So one is, you guys talked a little bit about like shocks to the system, specifically with like the land seizures that happened in 2011. I know this is kind of outside the time purview of the book, but with regards to the pandemic and like the zero COVID policies that China implemented, like what effect did that have on this kind of very informal construction sector? And the second question I have is, has there been any effort from the central government to try and formalize, the construction sector, have more stable contracting, more labor and wage protections and other things of that nature? Thank you.
Those are great questions. I wish I hadn't answered the first question. I am very curious about them myself. I haven't been able to go back to China since the pandemic, so I don't know, and I'm trying to rack my brain for who might know more on this. Marty, are you aware of anything? I wish, yeah, I mean, there has been a lot of work on pandemic conditions and its effect on, yeah, I don't know, actually. Yeah, none of the literature I know is about migrant labor and pandemic conditions. So I wish I had an answer for you on that. On the second question, which is, sorry, remind me your second question quickly.
Like, has there been any effort from the central government
Yes, yeah,
to
to improve
formalize?
labor conditions. Yeah.
Mhm.
So for the most part, there has been a huge amount of central government scrutiny of the construction sector. However, most of that has to do with the fact that due to local rural government deficit driven over spending, um, the construction sector has, as we all know from cases of huge private real estate developer bankruptcies like Evergrande, went close to bankruptcy and had to be bailed out. A lot of different developers have done this. The central government has started cracking down on overzealous urbanization. So they have this kind of red line policy, which says that each province has to make sure that they don't over commercialize their land. They don't convert too much land away from farming and toward real estate, which actually a lot of provincial governments have a real incentive to overbuild. Why? Because tax revenues from commercial development are much higher than tax revenues from agribusinesses. And so if you're a coastal, specifically for coastally located provinces, they have a real urge to kind of try to capitalize on big speculative increases in property values by overdeveloping a lot of the rural land that's near their cities. So a lot of that's happened. Private developers, so I had a undergraduate student at Boston College, was where I used to teach at, who did this fabulous research. Her name is Yitong Liu, and she's now a Brown graduate student in sociology. And she had this incredible research about how these developers themselves often would undertake these kind of illegal debt-based financing. Like they would start building one real estate basically like a living compound, right? Like a luxury priced real estate development in one part of the city. They would pre-sell all of those apartments. So if you've ever been to China, and most of Asia does this actually, they pre-sale properties, which means you buy the property before it's built even. You pick out the little number, they have a little lottery, and you have to go and to the main office at the time and you pick out which apartment slot you want, and then they build it. And so they collect down payments before they even start building. So what she found was a lot of these developers were taking down payments from one luxury real estate development and using those down payments to start construction on a second or even third location, where they would start building using down payments from another site. And so they would have this wholly, like maybe 4 or 5 development sites that were all scaffolded based on basically taking down payments from one site and then using it to start construction on another. And the assumption is that, oh, all of these sites will sell out and property values will rise. And as property values continue to rise, more and more demand will come and fill in the hole. And so they were built on these pyramid schemes. And when property values did start to teeter, you saw a lot of these property developers become just dangerously over leveraged, and they basically stopped construction midway through. And so that left a lot of basically these ghost cities where development sites would be half built, never finished. The people who pre-bought those apartments still had to pay off the mortgages. They were still on the hook for that and nobody bailed them out. And at the same time, they were a lot of them having to pay rent on a second property where they would actually live until their current property was being finished. And a lot of those properties never got finished. So there's a lot of lawsuits in the works and a lot of grievances and protests around property sales, where it's called lanwei like basically rotten end buildings, like where apartment buildings have been started, paid for, but not finished. And so that's kind of another thing that the local central government is cracking down on is stricter financing laws for real estate developers, which have no real implications for the construction sector that I was looking at. But that's the regulation that's come down from above, which is more strict financing rules for real estate developers, less in like overbuilding and runaway urbanization, runaway development among real estate developers. They're trying to crack down on that a lot. So a lot of laws have come into place, like you can no longer buy a second property or vacation home in many cities. They're kind of cracking down on people buying multiple investment properties in order to cool down the housing sector, which has seen a lot of this runaway inflationary spending. Yeah, but it doesn't have much effect on the workers.
Ellen?
I think, as you said earlier on in the presentation, you've done a great job talking about the pessimistic story about what this is occurring in the rural parts of China. I think I'm interested in talking as well a little bit about the story that the official party narratives are trying to portray in media. For example, with the Building a New Socialist Countryside campaign, and especially in the demonstration area in Zhejiang for common prosperity, they make a lot of promises for people living in rural areas, like we're going to build a new airport, we're going to build new roads, we're going to increase the amount of money that you make. And I know you spend a lot of time with villagers, talking to them and getting to know their lives personally. And beyond just losing their home and going into a new apartment, what about all of those other aspects of the social welfare package that the government is trying to provide to them? Are they optimistic that they're going to be able to provide better education opportunities for their children? Does that really incentivize this, or at least play into the narrative that I think that the party is trying to say, that by moving into these central townships, that there's more of an opportunity to take a part of all of the social welfare benefits that usually urban areas have only had access to? I'm wondering if any of the people you spoke to had any thoughts, whether pessimistic or optimistic, about those services.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if you look at the state media reporting on this entire rural revitalization movement, which has been ongoing for something like 20 years now, it looks great. I mean, the Central Communist Party is really making great promises, as you say, to rural people for, these townships are supposed to provide this really nice elevated lifestyle, right? There's also this unified hukou system that's supposed to provide access to public goods and services like education, healthcare, and pensions that rural people were previously excluded from by law, and now they're able to buy into. If you look at there's a ton of media reports about kind of pilot studies of pilot villages where maybe one village has really focused on ecotourism, another village is focused on rural tourism, and there's been a push in some villages to try to get young people back into farming, but more kind of craftsman style farming. So this is kind of small craftsmen's like farms where young people come back and they say, hey, this new township isn't your old, dilapidated village-based economy. Now we have, people doing like eco farming or small scale craftsman kind of production. A lot of people in cities are now interested in, because of scandals around food safety, a lot of them are interested in small kind of collective arrangements, kind of similar to farmers markets in the US, where you can buy like a quarter of a cow during the slaughter season, and it's completely organic meat. And so that's generated this new business for young farmers who want to cater toward this new kind of more ecologically, environmentally protective kind of form of small scale craftsman-like agriculture. So there's a lot of media reports about rural young people coming back to the village and townships to do this kind of work, and that it's income generating. There's even like I forget what her name is, but there's a really big influencer in China who makes a ton of money by basically having these, you can find her on YouTube and I forget her name, but she basically makes a lot of stuff from scratch. Do you know her name?
Is it Li Ziqi?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. Yeah. So she makes like all of these beautiful desserts and like all of these really traditional handicraft things from scratch. And she obviously has a big, so there's a lot of kind of, the state is really into promoting her as well, because she exemplifies this, the success of like, hopefully we're going to modernize the countryside, right? And revitalize it in a way that creates jobs for people. So that's what it looks like if you look at media reports, if you look at state media in particular. My experience while I was researching this book was that local governments would make a lot of promises, and central policy campaigns like the New Socialist Countryside Campaign, the Rural Revitalization Plan, would offer these really rosy accounts, and they would say things like, yes, we will take away people's land, but we're going to give them access to job retraining facilities. We're going to create new jobs for them. In reality, what I saw in the village I studied was that job retraining facility never materialized. Why? Well, it was in the works, but local government officials realized that that's kind of public welfare spending that they couldn't really afford, because this is a county that was really trying to hone in on, they were trying to use land commercialization profits in order to upgrade their own administrative status from being just a rural county to being a district, which would mean that basically if you're a local government official, you get more funds, disbursement funds for welfare spending and social spending from the city. If you're a district, you are directly governed under the municipality, so you get more subsidies. It's better for your career if you're a local government official. If you can engineer that kind of thing, you're more likely to get political promotions later in your career. And so they basically took a lot of the profits from rural modernization and used them for things that didn't generate broad welfare improvement for the local population, but instead things that looked better on paper if you're a local government official. So, for example, they built a lot of built infrastructure, like a huge aquifer, which was supposed to provide water for all of the local neighboring districts, and that made them look like they were a major part of the urban infrastructure for Chongqing. That was highly expensive, right? They built out huge highway systems, again, which were really good if you're an urban person trying to get to work, not so great if you're a rural person who doesn't even have a car. So they really spent more on infrastructure that was more urban facing than rural facing, particularly because they were looking for those political promotions and that kind of, the kind of economic development profile that would get them upgraded from a county to a district. So that's just one case, but I imagine that it's probably generalizable in different variations on the theme to a lot of other villages.
All right. So I think the what I've learned from like development economics is that a lot of the urbanization and there was a famous study I know of that was done that was specifically prescribed to China in rural to urban migration, where there would be more people would move to urban cities from rural villages, even if there was rural or urban unemployment, because there were jobs that were in the informal sector, jobs that aren't taxed by the government. And this study was done, I believe, in the 80s or 90s, but it was prescribed specifically to what was going on in China at the time, and now it applies to places like India, where there's a lot of this informal sector employment, and especially with the informal sector employment is very popular amongst women who are moving to the cities, because especially in India now is what I'm aware, especially because of kind of the gender relations that are in India. But specifically in China, is informal sector employment in the cities still a large draw for people moving from villages to the cities, or is that something that has kind of went away as China's developed beyond the 1990s?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, China is quite different from India. You're right. India, I mean, informal sector employment, I think, dwarfs formal sector employment in India. China never really had the same situation. I would say that in China, the corollary to the India informal sector thing was that land rights in the countryside allowed the rural sector to mask a lot of unemployment in the countryside. So basically, a lot of the unemployed people during financial downturns, factories would close, and then people would go back home to the villages. But the state census doesn't count them as unemployed because they're still technically doing subsistence farming. So that was the kind of role of informality, is in just masking rural unemployment. Most large cities try to cut down on informal sector growth. You do see a lot of, particularly in so-called migrant villages in the city, every time Beijing, and by the way, Beijing has expanded, like the newly built out peri-urban regions of Beijing is about the size of Kansas. Like it's incredibly, the amount of built urban infrastructure in China today versus 20 years ago is just an astronomical expansion. A lot of those newly built peri-urban regions, you will see a little bit of informal sector growth. Why? Because as those villages that used to be outside of Beijing get absorbed in Beijing, those people, those rural people lose their access to land. They get rehoused in these townships that become basically migrant villages. And then within those small migrant villages, people basically use what small property rights they have to establish small earning opportunities. So they might take their apartment and split it into 5 compartments and try to rent it out to other people who need housing, for example. And so that's the kind of informal sector growth that we're seeing, is kind of migrant village in the city as a vestige of expanded urbanization. So in Chongqing, they had a lot of that going on. That's where you saw a lot of the informalization. A lot of it is subject to local governance. So a lot of local government, basically at the central government level, Chinese leaders looked at India and they said, we don't want that to happen. They looked at Brazil and said, we don't want that to happen. We don't want huge slums on the outskirts of our cities. It's so disorderly. We want a more state engineered urbanization where we can rehouse people when we need to, and kind of control the amount of rural urban migration there is. So basically, I don't think that informal sector provides as much. I think the informal sector where it does play a role is basically in the small businesses that land losing households do establish. I mean, it is not clear to me, on the other hand, that or that entrepreneurial rates are rising among land-losing households. I just reviewed a paper that was about whether entrepreneurial rates rise or fall among urban and rural households that lose land, where they have their houses demolished. Do they then, are they more likely or less likely to start small businesses? This paper found that it was less likely, but they didn't disaggregate between urban and rural. I actually, in my work, I've been looking at the CFHS to look at entrepreneurial rates, and I think they do rise among land-losing households, slightly, a very small rise. There's still pretty low rates or entrepreneurial rates among rural households. Why? It takes a lot of capital to start a small business. And then you're kind of more talking about the informal sector in terms of like working for another small business that's informal itself. Again, I don't think it's to the same, I don't think it's comparable to India. I think there's just more governance focused on trying to control informal sector growth within cities. So.
Tart.
Hi, so kind of similar to Aiden's, but you know, when we talk about a lot of these types of reforms and things like that within India and honestly within Southeast Asia, a lot of it is like that it helps women, that it helps bring them into the workforce, and that it's an opportunity for them to earn more for their families or even to give them financial independence. But then there's also the flip side of that argument, which is that it traps them and it's more of an exploitative system. And you're right, this is not the same as what India has or what Brazil has. So could you speak to maybe how this is bringing or how this affects the gender disparity?
I don't know much. I don't know much about the current situation. I think that there was talk about how there was a refeminization of agriculture under the labor-intensive era. So back when people still had land rights, who was doing that farming? Well, a lot of times what would happen was the man had higher earning potential in cities, so he would migrate to cities on the coast and work there, and then the woman would remain back and try to raise the kids and also farm the land. So you did see this refeminization of agriculture at the time. I only have anecdotal evidence from my own qualitative work. I haven't looked into the statistical, like, or the survey-based for more large and generalizable information on how wage gaps are being impacted. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think there is work on this. Probably Scott Roselle has work on this, but I haven't looked into it lately, so I'm not sure. Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah. I did have one more question, if that's okay. Yeah. So when I look at the sound of this, like, you know, land reforms now allow rural households to lease land and things like that. This sounds pretty capitalistic, at least like that's kind of the streak that it's gearing towards. So how would you say this is perceived socially or politically when you have expectations of like socialism with Chinese characteristics and that sort of narrative? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I have a Chinese colleague named Shengxiang Chen who he had earlier work. He's an economist at Jiangsu University of Finance and Economics, and he had some early work about how rural people themselves view their land rights. And as we know, like rural people have a pretty tenuous hold on land. Like they're issued rural land rights universally, meaning everyone born in a rural area gets them, but they only get like what's 30-year land use rights contract, and the actual underlying land right goes to the village collective. So no one actually owns their land in the underlying ownership sense. They just own the use rights to the land for 30 years with the assumption that that contract will be renewed every 30 years. That's how in the West we understand Chinese land rights. But he went and he interviewed people in Chinese villages, and he found actually great variation in how people understand their land rights. He said, he went to villages where people, I guess in some villages, they don't do what they're supposed to do. What they're supposed to do is when people die and new babies are born, they're supposed to take the land from dying people and give it to new babies. And they do that as needed, right? They're supposed to update their land allocation as births and deaths occur. In some villages, they don't do that. And he went to some villages where they just don't do that, meaning households will have huge plots of land because someone died and they never took the land back from them. And some households will have very small plots of land because they had a bunch of babies and then nobody gave them new land. He went to those villages and he found that people in those villages actually believed that they had underlying ownership rights to land because they weren't reallocating land like they were supposed to. And then he went to villages where they were reallocating land with births and deaths and found that people had a much more legalistic sense of the land use right. They knew that there were temporary 30-year contracts and that they were actually fairly precarious. So I do think that there is huge variation in how people understand the underlying land rights. Now you're asking about the land market. If you actually go online and look at almost every city since 2013 has established a land portal where you can see people leasing their land and they have photographs of the land and offers for land lease contracts and price arrangements and et cetera. So you can very much see that there's a real awareness of a land lease contract out there. And all of these land portals are set up by local government, they're local government websites, basically. So they're trying to be as transparent as possible. It looks like a land market if you look at it online. If you actually go to the villages and talk to people, a lot of those land leasing arrangements are kind of insider track things where the village collective has coerced the household into leasing the land, and then they have some land lesser already in mind that they want to lease the land to. Usually they're trying to consolidate large plots of land. In many villages, and Joel Andres' work is a lot about this, in many villages, powerful households have kind of gobbled up huge plots of village land, and they have themselves become like agribusinesses. They call them danonghu, like big household farms, but they're basically agribusinesses. And most of the farming now is done along these terms, actually. So I think there's a lot of variation, basically, in how the land market is being perceived. And I think the perception is very different from the actual practice.
Yeah, thank you.
You, sir.
All of the ghost towns and all these unoccupied high rises that you saw in the media in the last few years. Question is, how big is that inventory? Is there an active foreclosure procedure that can dispose of it? Is it a matter of, people jumping the gun? There are no jobs for the people to move there, no incentive to move there. And to what extent does the central government bear political embarrassment for, a lack of urban planning? Or is this a local, hey, you guys screwed up on a local basis, even though we approved it?
That's a great question. I think it's the latter. I think they're trying to downshift a lot of the blame to local governments who are being overzealous in overspending and not fully governing these runaway private developers who are being too greedy, right? So they're trying to kind of slough off the blame onto them. In terms of how many people, like what's happening, I think, so Yitong Liu's work was about a lot of these rural people have gone to social media and they go to Douyin, Chinese TikTok. We should call our TikTok American Douyin, actually, but they go onto TikTok and they are posting these videos about, they're kind of humorous videos so that they don't get censored, about how they're trying to live in these dilapidated concrete like structures that are entirely, like unsafe. They're basically just the skeleton structure of a high-rise building. A lot of people are filming their attempts to live in them in order to bring attention to the fact that they're still paying a mortgage on basically a house that's never going to be finished. And so this form of mobilization is kind of new. A lot of people sympathize. A lot of Chinese people are sympathizing with the posters of these videos. It's a pretty widespread phenomenon. I would number the people who have, who are, you mentioned the word foreclosure, but have mortgages that they're still paying and no house to live in the tens or maybe hundreds of thousands. So it's not a huge scale phenomenon. Most of them are not rural. Most of them are urban. People who are trying to relocate to kind of luxury buildings that where the developer went bankrupt. The rural resettlement usually happens in a more the price point is lower, and most of the developers that are building out for rural resettlement, they don't build out so overzealously because they're selling those units at a state subsidized rate. And so, of course, there's mixed housing. Like Yi Tong had studied a bunch of housing development sites where some of the housing was being marketed as luxury housing for urbanites. Some of it was being sold at subsidized rates to military people. Some of it was being sold at subsidized rates to people who lost their housing, rural people who lost their housing during demolition of their village. But for the most part, I think the proportions are, it's majority urban people who have lost, who are more victimized by this overbuilding that's Langwei low, like rotten end building craze, I guess. In terms of what's been happening in terms of rehabilitation, a lot of these cases went to court, and in many of the cases, the homeowners won the lawsuits, but the courts have no way to compel developers to actually pay up. Why? Because developers file for bankruptcy and they say, oh, we don't have the funds to pay. And so these cases are in limbo. They have won the lawsuit, but most of these cases, the residents haven't actually won any kind of form of financial redress. In most cases, they don't want their mortgages canceled. They just want the developer to somehow finish their housing. They want their housing, basically. Local governments are not actually putting money into finishing the housing. They can't afford to. In some cases, they've offered them temporary resettlement housing, so lower quality housing where they can live while they continue to wait to no end. I don't think of in any single case that Yi Tong studied, none of the cases, she followed around 8 different developers that were going bankrupt and people who had bought housing with them. In none of the cases did they actually receive the housing that they were promised. So they're still kind of in limbo.
Hi. So I've read that in China, even for urbanites, their disposable income is still not growing very quickly compared to GDP. And I'm sure a lot of that's because of this runaway development. And also taking that into account, as well as maybe these rural people being forced to lease their land for rates that are not receiving appropriate compensation or appropriate income for giving up their land, and also local governments misusing funds that are supposed to go towards job development for rural people. Do you think that the Chinese government will achieve their long-term goal of trying to significantly raise domestic consumption to something more like a developed country?
That's a really hard question. I'm not an economist. I don't know if I can answer that question. I think that the rural urban wage gap is still, I mean, even though they don't measure it, I mean, okay, even though a lot of rural people have technically transferred to urban hukou, their hukou is still in these townships. And these townships are being managed by local government officials that have their own goals in mind. So not necessarily promoting the kind of capital investment that will generate a ton of jobs for local residents. They're more interested in the kind of local investment, like real estate investment, instead of manufacturing. Real estate investment brings a lot of revenues for local government officials. It looks really good for urbanizing regions, but it doesn't actually create that many jobs. It doesn't create as many jobs as factories, for example. So I do think that the urban-rural wage gap is still an issue, even though the formerly rural population is now being re-registered as urban. Now you're just seeing that wage inequality being transposed to like township versus city inequality. As to the larger question about whether they can really boost domestic consumption by bringing up real wages. Yeah, I can't answer the question. I wish I could. Yeah.
We have time for one more quick questions.
Oh, thank you for the speech. I just wonder, in your book or your research, do you consider the heterogeneity of the Chinese religion? Because I come from a more developed city like Jiangsu and Zhejiang province. The rural religion in Jiangsu and Zhejiang province is very different from other places in China, like Henan province, where I get my undergraduate period education. And during that time, I do many in agriculture economy. So I go to many in our rural places in Henan province. That's very different from the Zhejiang province. And the places you pick for the book, Sichuan, Chongqing, and Guizhou, we call it in Guichuan in China. It's another very different place because they have many mountain area. So I wonder, do you think the heterology will have effect on the result and our conclusion? Because, for example, for the state in engineered urbanization for this page, I think, for example, for the Zhejiang and Jiangsu province, we have already get that. But from my perspective, I think it's very hard to get in Chongqing and Sichuan. Just like the reason why China has a Chongqing province, because we want to like the capital city in Chongqing to get the people around them like that. So I wonder what's your opinion about this way? Thank you.
About the sustenance of indigenous religious practices within rural areas, or
yeah, heterology.
Yeah, the heterogeneity of these practices. Yeah, I mean, I didn't spend that much time in Guizhou, but I spent a little bit of time in Guizhou, maybe 3 or 4 months, and there is a lot of particularly in there's a lot of very interesting, like, kind of rich spiritual religious life in villages that's very much about ancestral continuity. So in order for those practices to sustain, you need kind of the built infrastructure of the village and the continuation of kinship networks that have existed in that village for a long time. You need people to maintain these norms and these religious practices. So for sure, this new state engineered urbanization is disrupting a lot of this kind of more indigenous, ancestral, and religious practice. I think in the coastal areas, somehow, a lot of the more spiritual practices have been able to stay in place because I'm not an expert on religion, so I'm not totally sure, but I have seen a lot more studies of villages in Fujian province, for example, where ancestral like practices and religious practices are still in place because they've taken money from migrant remittances and built up kind of shrines and family shrines and this kind of thing. Again, I'm not an expert on this. I think that in inland regions, it might be more disruptive. This urbanization might be more disruptive because the rural urban integration is much lower. Commercialization levels are much lower. So it means that when rural people lose their land, they're being relocated forcibly to townships that are a little bit further away. And then their kinship ties are much more disrupted. Like instead of every person in your family tree being able to afford an apartment in the new township, what I saw was a lot of families I saw a lot of bachelors who just didn't buy housing once they lost their land because they couldn't afford it. And so they would just live with extended family. I saw multiple families pooling their money together in order to afford an apartment in the township. And so they were living in cramped circumstances. You saw a lot more well-off families going to higher property appreciation, more commercial areas like the outskirts of Chongqing instead of the local township because property values were going to rise higher there. They had more job opportunities there. They could afford to live in the migrant village in Chongqing instead of the local township. And so local kin networks were really rent apart by this Yau Tianxing would call this deterritorialized. So a lot of old kinship structures are really deterritorialized and broken up by this urbanization. I think that's more prevalent in inland regions than coastal regions. And so I think by extension, that would probably disrupt a lot of the religious practice.
Well, thank you, Professor, for your talk on your book. It was very enriching, especially after reading the book. to hear about this topic, and I recommend that everyone read the book Beneath the China Boom: Labor, Citizenship, and the Making of the Rural Land Market.
Yes, just a few last words before we go, because this is it for our 2025 spring conference. I just want to pay tribute to all the people that put in a lot of effort to make this happen. Whether it's getting the food here for today, or like Mike, our student moderators, they read these books, they really engaged with the scholarship, they tried to come up with thoughtful questions. And again, to our two speakers who came, would you please give a round of applause for everyone who helped today? We'll have more events later in the term, so please follow us on China Affairs Forum at GW at social media, and we'll try to see you at another one of our events this term. Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, like